Voice, communication, speech. How does what we sound like define who we are? Can you tell what a person looks like with your eyes closed?
What does sounding white mean to you?
Sounding white to me is kind of like an idea. It's like a stigma. Sometimes I think it's like a standard for people to be held to.
I think for me, it's kind of like this little microaggression where it's like, it means sounding, for a lot of people who say it, sounding white means that you sound educated, or that you sound smart, which is kind of dumb because, like, why does one race sound smarter than another? I think sounding white means it's a synonym for sounding articulate. It's a synonym for not using any sorts of slang that are associated with your racial group.
One of the most commonly referred to forms of slang is something called African American Vernacular English, but is often referred to as much more insulting names. African American Vernacular English is a valid form of English recognized alongside with American General English and British English. We interviewed Kai Davis, a Central grad and renowned spoken word poet who's well known for her poem If I Look Like, a poem about being told she sounds white.
So I guess the first question is, what does sounding white mean to you?
What does it mean to me personally? I think it's kind of cloaked language. When they say to sound white, they mean educated. They mean what the standard is for what's appropriate or what's respectable. Because white people get to decide what the standard is, what's respectable, what intellectual speech sounds and looks like. Because we speak English in America, and that's European. So sounding white, it's not a real thing because colors really don't have sounds, but it's like a political thing.
What do you think the connotation behind sounding white is?
It depends on who's saying it and when and why. A lot of the times, students of color will tease other students of color by saying that they sound white, which is to say that they're other than this community because they speak standard English or don't use slang or AAVE or any other type of vernacular. So it's just like another way of bullying, but it's also problematic in its own right because when people say oh, you talk white, and they mean it as an insult, but they mean it like you're not fitting into the status quo. You don't do what a person of color is supposed to be doing, which is not having a vast vocabulary or so it's a very nuanced kind of conversation.
Has anyone ever made you feel like you aren't a part of their group because of the way you speak?
Definitely. I remember just being in middle school and having all the kids be like, oh, you sound white, you sound so white, oh my god, why don't you sound like a normal Puerto Rican girl? I'm supposed to have big hoop earrings, my hair's supposed to be tied back, and I'm supposed to chew gum and smack my mouth whenever I'm saying anything.
So what happens when you don't have this vernacular mastered, but it still matches your skin tone? That's fine, right? Surprisingly, many people find difficulty with people who don't speak the way they expect them to sound. Sometimes, sounding white is met with praise. Sometimes it's met with condemnation. Either way, by most people who are told that they sound white, it's perceived as an insult.
I hate receiving praise for sounding white. It's the worst thing. It's the most backhanded comment. It's like, oh, good job. You got as close to being us as possible.
Yes.
You have accomplished something.
Good
job. Congratulations. Do you want to, this is a round of applause for the black girl who can sound like us.
For many, assigning people to a vernacular is very important and even goes as far as the courtroom. Linguistic profiling is a term used to define the prejudice people of color face for sounding a certain way. Linguistic profiling has been a topic of research for years, and the effects have even been observed in the courtroom. In the 1999 Charles Clifford v. Commonwealth of Kentucky case, linguistic profiling made a very clear appearance. In this case, the man who testified said that he heard 4 people in a room. The first was a male he knew, the second another male whom he didn't know, the third was a woman, and the fourth was a black male. How could he tell? Well, he said some black males have a different sound of their voice. So what is this elusive tone that they speak about? Well, it is possible that they are talking about Ebonics, also known as African American Vernacular English, which follows a different speech pattern and intonation than formal English. Though this is a valid form of English that many African Americans use to communicate, there is an important defining factor that people tend to overlook. Not all African Americans speak this way.
I mean, I talk in a lot of different ways, like code switching is a thing, so, and because of that, like, I'm able to, I feel like it gives me like a broader lens, and, you know, I write poetry, like, for a living, so sometimes I use, like, African American vernacular English in my writing, or I, like, deconstruct the way that English language is normally heard and do stuff with it because I have a grasp of it, and I can do that. Like, I can play with it. So I've been praised for my ability to speak. I'm sure people sometimes probably thought, like, oh, you're so eloquent. Oh, you're so articulate. And they're, like, surprised or something.
Have your experiences with the notion of speaking white made you feel left out?
Definitely. For me, I went to a majority white middle school, and so there it was just normal. Like, that's how all the black people there talked, because that's just like, that's what we grew up around. Like, that's the environment we grew up in. And then I came to a school where there was more black people who had grown up speaking a different way from me, and that was really just limiting in my, like, you're like, oh, this isn't like what I'm supposed to sound like. Mm-hmm. And you kind of question, what am I supposed to sound like?
Yeah.
African Americans aren't the only people who run into this phrase. Asian Americans, Latino and Spanish Americans, and any other non-white population have all expressed frustration with these words. Though we weren't able to interview any Asian American people, what we have found is that many Asian American people run into the phrase of being told that they speak good English, as if the expectation was that their first language was not English, and in fact another Asian dialect. This is a closed-minded notion that stems from the idea that only white people could have English as their first language.
People seem to forget that there's an entire continent of white people who don't speak English. Like, I'm sorry. I don't understand how white people have automatically claimed this vernacular that was influenced greatly by black people.
I think that, you know, it's just kind of symbolic of the way that people think about race in America. It's like there's so much conflict. Like, you have your cultural group and you try to maintain that cultural identity within that group, but you're also living in a larger, like, a larger cultural sphere that's, like, dictated by, like, white supremacy and, like, white dominance. So it's pretty much just a symbol of that. Like, they're just always in contradiction with one another. So you have people denigrating each other for assimilating to a culture that makes you assimilate to the culture, you know, so it's complicated.
I feel like there are certain indications sometimes you can, depending on the area that you're in. But I think because of my experiences that I've had with sounding white, I don't typically assign a race to a person when I hear them speak until I see them or I ask them.
It's like, you can kind of tell because there's tones and indications, but, like, you can't be sure. And I think it is a closed-minded notion to think. It's a closed-minded notion to think I can close my eyes and I know what's around me. Which you don't. You don't know what's around you. You know what you think is around you, but those images that you come up with first can't guide your whole perception of a person.
So, how does what we sound like define who we are? Can you tell what a person looks like with your eyes closed?